The sun broke over the Cascade Range like spilled honey, painting the ridgeline where Robert Fairchild stood in shades of amber and gold. At 52, he had the bearing of a man accustomed to dominance, broad shoulders, iron-gray beard, hands that had signed contracts worth fortunes but hadn't touched an axe in 20 years. Below him stretched his kingdom, 10,000 acres of timber operations, the stumps marching in neat rows down the mountainside like tombstones in some vast cemetery. He didn't see tombstones, he saw dollars. Another section ready for harvest. Mr. Fairchild, his foreman, Davies, gestured toward the virgin stand of Douglas fir to the east, trees that had stood for 3 centuries, waiting. "We can have crews in there by week's end." Robert nodded, and already calculating. Board feet per acre, transport costs to the mills, market prices in Portland and San Francisco. The mathematics of extraction had made him wealthy beyond his father's dreams. Every tree was inventory, every acre a ledger entry. "The spring's gone dry again, sir." Davies pointed to a rocky outcrop where a thin trickle of water had once flowed year-round. "Third one this month. Seasonal variation." Robert waved the concern away. "Rain'll come," but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. The drought had stretched through June and July, unusual for Oregon territory. The streams that fed his sawmills ran lower each week. Still, he'd faced dry spells before. Weather was cyclical. It always changed. A dust devil swirled up from the clear cut below, spinning through the stumps in a column of brown air. Another followed, then another small tornadoes of exposed topsoil, dancing across land that had been shaded forest floor for millennia. Robert watched them with mild interest. Nothing more. The wind was picking up. "Get the crews moving," he said. "I want that eastern section marked by Monday." He descended the trail toward his operations, boots crunching on ground that should have been soft with moss and fallen needles. Instead, everything was dust and wood chips. The morning air smelled of sawdust and resin, the perfume of industry. In the distance, his mills sent up columns of steam and smoke, 5 sawmills now, the largest operation in the territory, near the dried spring. Someone had left a wooden bucket on its side. Robert stepped over it without a second glance, his mind already on the contracts waiting in his Portland office. There were investors to meet, expansion plans to finalize, competitors to outmaneuver. The bucket lay where it had fallen, empty. Above him, the dust devils multiplied, pulling soil into the sky that would never return to these mountains. The land was showing him something, trying to speak in a language he'd forgotten how to understand. But Robert Fairchild was already halfway down the mountain, calculating his empire's growth, blind to the fact that empires built on extraction always, eventually. The rain came on August 23rd with a violence that felt personal. It wasn't the gentle Oregon mist that usually blessed the valleys, but torrential sheets that turned the sky black at midday. Robert stood in his Portland office watching water hammer the windows, feeling the first prickle of unease. 3 days of this deluge, unprecedented for late summer. The telegraph lines were down. No word from the mountain operations. When the wires finally restored, the news came in fragments flooding. Mudslides, devastation. The town of Cascade Springs, a valley settlement 20 miles downstream from his largest clear-cut, had been hit hardest. Robert took the train north through rain that refused to quit. The town looked like a war had passed through it. Mud coated everything 3 feet high. Buildings sat askew on shifted foundations. The general store had collapsed entirely, its timbers scattered like kindling. They'd pulled 3 bodies from the debris shopkeeper Henry Walsh, 6-year-old Sarah Brennan, and a pregnant woman named Margaret Chen who'd been visiting from Portland. Robert stood in the devastated main street, rain still falling, and felt the weight of 100 eyes on him. No one spoke to him directly, but the silence carried accusation. The town meeting convened in the one building left intact, the church. 200 people packed the pews, muddy and furious. Robert sat in the front row, flanked by his lawyers, trying to look sympathetic while his mind worked on liability calculations. The young man who stood to speak was Chinese, slight of build, maybe 25 years old. He wore round spectacles and carried a leather portfolio that looked too heavy for his frame. "My name is Samuel Chen." His voice was quiet but steady. "I'm a forestry student at the agricultural college. Margaret Chen was my mother." The silence in the church became absolute. Samuel opened his portfolio. Extracting large sheets of technical drawings, he moved to the front, hanging them on nails someone had hammered into the wall for exactly this purpose. "This is what a forest does." He pointed to a cross-section showing root systems spreading through soil layers. "Trees act as living sponges. Roots hold topsoil. Canopy intercepts rainfall. Water infiltrates slowly rather than running off as flood." He flipped to the next diagram, the same hillside. But clear-cut. This is what happens without them. No roots to hold soil. No canopy to slow rain. Everything runs downhill at once, carrying tons of sediment and debris. His finger traced the path from the mountains to the valley below. "This is why 3 people died. This is why your homes are destroyed." Robert's lawyer stood. "These are theoretical drawings, not evidence. I have hydrological surveys," Samuel's voice sharpened. "Stream flow data, soil retention studies from European forestry programs, and photographs of Mr. Fairchild's operations taken 2 weeks ago, showing clear-cutting directly above this watershed with no erosion controls whatsoever." He looked directly at Robert for the first time. "You treated forests as inventory, but they were infrastructure, and you demolished the infrastructure that kept this valley safe." Robert surged to his feet, anger flashing hot. "I run a lawful business. Boy, you're an idealistic fool who doesn't understand economic realities. This territory was built on timber, jobs, growth, progress." "My mother is dead." Samuel's words cut through the room like winter wind. "Because you couldn't see past board feet." The meeting dissolved into shouting. Robert's lawyers hustled him out through the back, but not before he'd grabbed one of Samuel's diagrams, the one showing roots as nature's sponges, and the terrible empty spaces where those sponges had been removed. That night, in his Portland mansion, Robert burned the diagram in his fireplace and watched the technical drawings curl and blacken. But when he closed his eyes, he still saw those empty spaces in the soil, cross-section void where life should be, absence where structure had once existed. He dreamed of drowning in mud that tasted like sawdust. September brought no rain. The brief deluge that had caused the flooding disappeared as if it had never been. Day after day of cloudless sky, temperatures climbing into the 80s when they should have been cooling. The streams that powered Robert's sawmills dropped from flow to trickle to nothing. By mid-September, he'd shut down 2 mills entirely. The water wheels sat motionless, their paddles dry. 300 men out of work, their families facing a winter without wages. Robert's business partners sent increasingly frantic telegrams: cut more aggressively, flood the market before prices drop, liquidate inventory. But Robert stood beside mill number 3 watching the creek bed lie exposed, stones that should have been underwater baking in the sun, and thought about sponges, about empty spaces, about water that used to be here and wasn't anymore. "Mr. Fairchild." He turned to find Samuel Chen sitting on a horse at the mill's edge, that same leather portfolio strapped to his saddle. "I don't want your accusations," Robert said flatly. "I didn't come to accuse." Samuel dismounted, moving to stand beside him at the creek bank. "I came to offer information, whether you use it is your choice." He opened the portfolio, extracting documents. Robert saw maps, charts, dense paragraphs in what looked like German. "European forestry programs have managed production forests for centuries," Samuel said. "Sustainable yield, selective cutting, watershed protection. They're not romantic idealists, they're businessmen who learned that you can't extract forever." He handed Robert a translated paper from a Prussian forestry institute. They calculated that maintaining forest cover over 70% of a watershed ensures consistent stream flow, below 50%. You get exactly what's happening here: seasonal flooding and seasonal drought, both getting worse over time. "I'm at 30% or so, aren't I? 22% on your main watershed, and dropping." Robert stared at the dry stream bed. His mills needed water. His business needed those mills. Everything he'd built was grinding to a halt, not because of environmentalist sentiment, but because the basic infrastructure water itself was failing. "You can keep extracting until there's nothing left to extract," Samuel said quietly, "including the water your mills need, or you can learn to work with living systems instead of against them." Robert wanted to dismiss him again, wanted to find the flaw in the logic, wanted this young Chinese idealist to be wrong, but the empty creek bed was evidence that couldn't be argued with. "One consultation," Robert heard himself say. "Show me what you're talking about, then I decide." Samuel nodded. "Tomorrow, dress for riding." He remounted and rode off, leaving Robert alone beside the silent water wheel for the first time in his adult life. Robert Fairchild didn't know what to do. The mathematics of extraction had always been so simple cut. Mill, sell, profit, but the equation was missing variables he'd never learned to see. He looked down at the dry stones in the creek bed and saw, for just a moment, what this place used to be, what he'd taken, what he'd emptied, the bucket tipped over, the water gone, and no rain in sight. They rode out at dawn, Samuel leading them into watersheds Robert had logged years ago. The morning air was cool, but the sun already felt harsh. Unfiltered by the canopy that should have been there, dust rose from their horses' hooves. The first stop was a hillside Robert remembered as thick timber 5 years back. Now it was a moonscape of erosion gullies and exposed bedrock. What little topsoil remained had formed thin crusts that cracked under the horses' weight. 6 inches of topsoil takes 1,000 years to form, Samuel said. Dismounting, he knelt, scooping up a handful of the dusty earth. "You removed it in an afternoon. See, those gullies' water should infiltrate slowly. Instead it runs straight downhill, carving deeper channels each rain. That's what hit Cascade Springs." Robert said nothing. What was there to say? They rode to Pine Creek, which Robert remembered as vibrant salmon spawning grounds. The water was murky brown, the bottom choked with silt and logging debris. Samuel pointed to the gravel bars where fish used to lay eggs. "Buried, salmon need clean gravel and cold water. You've destroyed both." He squatted by the stream, turning over rocks. Nothing lived underneath. This creek used to feed a dozen communities downstream. Commercial fishermen, indigenous peoples who've harvested here for 10,000 years. All gone now. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask." Samuel stood, brushing off his hands. That's not the same as innocent. They visited a farming settlement where wells had gone dry. A woman Robert's age showed them her garden withered plants. "Cracked earth. Used to have a spring up the mountain," she said, voice flat with resignation. "Fed our well. Watered the cattle. Ran year-round for 60 years. My father said. Stopped last April." She pointed to a line of buckets sitting empty along her fence. "Haul water from the river now, 3 miles each way. Takes all morning to, and we're rationing anyway." Robert counted 12 buckets. While mapped, waiting, Samuel took him higher into the mountains, to areas where indigenous peoples still held small parcels of land. An old Kalapuya man named Joseph spoke through Samuel's translation, explaining forest management practices that stretched back centuries. "They burned selectively," Samuel explained. "Small controlled fires that cleared undergrowth but left mature trees, created meadows for game, prevented catastrophic burns, managed the forest as a living system that provided sustained resources, food, medicine, materials for generations. We called it wilderness," Robert said slowly, understanding dawning, "but it was tended, managed, for 10,000 years, then we called it empty land and clear-cut it in a decade." The last stop was the dried creek bed where Robert had seen the empty bucket days before. But there weren't just 1 or 2 buckets now. There were dozens, maybe 50 of them, left by farmers and ranchers who'd given up on the spring that no longer flowed. Robert stood among them, surrounded by evidence of absence. Empty buckets, empty creek beds, empty salmon streams. His wealth had been built by emptying the land's reserves, spending ecological capital accumulated over millennia as if it would last forever. "Can any of this be undone?" he asked, voice rough. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "Not undone, The salmon runs some of those bloodlines are extinct. The topsoil that washed away, we won't see that rebuilt in our lifetimes. Your mother, those two others who died. He stopped, collecting himself, not undone. Then what? Redirected. We can replant, protect what's left, manage for regeneration instead of extraction. The systems will heal. Slowly, some of them. Samuel looked at Robert directly. But it requires seeing forests as living capital, not dead inventory. Thinking in generations, not quarters, and accepting that some damage is permanent. They rode back in silence as the sun set behind mountains that looked skeletal without their canopy. Robert's mind worked through calculations of a different kind, now not profit margins but restoration timelines, not extraction rates but regeneration cycles. He was 52 years old, and everything he knew was wrong. The announcement shocked Portland's timber elite to silence. Robert Fairchild, the territory's most aggressive logging baron, was hiring a Chinese forestry student as a senior consultant, implementing European-style sustainable practices, establishing experimental reforestation programs. His business partners called an emergency meeting. Robert faced them across the polished boardroom table, unmoved by their outrage. "You're going to bankrupt us," Charles Hendricks sputtered, chasing some romantic notion of, "I'm going to save the water our mills need to operate." Robert cut in. "We're at 22% forest cover on our main watershed. European studies show we need minimum 50% for consistent stream flow. We're literally sawing off the branch we're sitting on." He slid Samuel's reports across the table. Most of them didn't even look. "The boys' people work railroads," another partner sneered. "What does he know about timber more than we do about forests?" Robert stood. "This is happening with or without your support. I'd prefer with." They chose without. Two partners sold their shares to a rival company within the week. The work began in November's cold rain. Robert purchased degraded land adjacent to his operations acres he'd logged years ago and abandoned. Samuel designed planting schemes mixing Douglas fir, cedar, maple, and alder in patterns that mimicked natural succession. Robert found himself in a tree nursery, hands in soil for the first time in decades. The seedlings were fragile things, barely taller than his hand. Samuel showed him how to check root development, assess soil moisture, calculate survival rates. "These won't be harvestable for 80 years, Samuel said. "Transplanting a Douglas fir seedling, maybe longer. I'll be dead. Then you're planting for someone else. That's the point." Something shifted in Robert's chest. His entire career had been about what he could extract, acquire, accumulate in his lifetime. The idea of planting for future generations, strangers he'd never meet, felt radical and somehow right. They worked together through the winter. Samuel taught Robert to read landscapes, how slope and aspect affected species distribution, how soil composition revealed watershed health, how indicator plants showed ecosystem recovery. Robert discovered he had an aptitude for it. His business mind grasped the long-term economics of sustainability that managed forests, generated sustained yield indefinitely, while clear-cuts generated one-time profit followed by collapse. But the costs mounted. Replanting was expensive. Selective cutting generated less board feet per acre than clear cutting. Protecting riparian corridors meant leaving valuable timber unharvested. Robert's quarterly profits plummeted. His adult son, Thomas, cornered him at the family Christmas dinner. "Father, people are calling you a tree-hugging fool. The business is bleeding money. The workers think you've lost your mind." Thomas's voice carried desperation. "What are you doing?" Robert looked at his son, 30 years old, being groomed to take over the empire. "I'm trying to leave you something that will actually last, not just wealth, but the capacity to generate it sustainably, by going bankrupt, by learning to see past next quarter." Thomas left early, and slamming the door. Robert's wife retreated to her room in tight-lipped silence. He spent Christmas evening alone in his study, reviewing seedling survival data by lamplight. The social isolation deepened. Former business associates stopped returning his calls. The Portland Club asked him to resign his membership quietly, but firmly. Workers circulated petitions demanding return to proven methods. Even his church community whispered about Chinese influence and radical European ideas corrupting good American enterprise. But in the experimental plots, seedlings were taking root. In the protected riparian corridors, native plants were returning. It was slow, painful, expensive work with no immediate payoff. Yet Robert found himself waking each morning with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One January evening, he and Samuel stood in the nursery checking frost damage, thousands of seedlings in neat rows, barely visible in the fading light. "My partners are attempting a hostile takeover," Robert said quietly. "They've secured financing to buy me out, force liquidation of the experimental programs." Samuel was silent for a long moment. "I should resign. My involvement is costing you everything." "No." Robert touched one of the seedlings, feeling the tender green growth under his rough fingers. "This is costing me everything. But it's the first thing I've done in 30 years that actually matters." The seedling bent under his touch, then sprang back, fragile but alive, growing despite everything. "We keep planting," Robert said. Samuel nodded. They worked until full dark, their breath visible in the cold air, hands muddy, planting trees they'd never see mature, and somehow, in the gathering darkness, that felt exactly right. February brought the coordinated assault. The Oregonian published a front-page exposé, "Timber Barons Folly, Fairchild's Chinese Radical Experiments Threaten Jobs." The article quoted anonymous industry insiders claiming Robert was mentally unstable, that Oriental influences were corrupting American business, that European forestry models would bankrupt the territory's core industry. 3 banks simultaneously called Robert's loans. His remaining business partner, the last one who'd stayed neutral, sold out to Marcus Webb, his most aggressive competitor. Webb now controlled 40% of Fairchild Timber's board. The workers' petition reached critical mass, 200 signatures demanding return to standard practices or they'd seek employment elsewhere. Robert's operations manager quit, taking half the supervisory staff with him. Robert sat in his office reviewing the carnage. His ledgers showed depleted cash reserves, his business stripped of loyal management. His reputation destroyed. The hostile takeover attempt had morphed into a coordinated industry campaign to crush him before his dangerous ideas spread. Samuel appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "I'm resigning," he said formally, "effective immediately. This has gone too far. Your family, your business, your standing. I can't be responsible for destroying all of it. You're not responsible. I made this choice. Because I showed you, because I was destroying something I didn't understand, and you helped me see it." Robert leaned back in his chair, suddenly exhausted. "Don't insult me by assuming I'm not capable of making my own decisions." Samuel moved to the window, looking out at the Portland streets below. "What if you're wrong? What if sustainable practices can't work at commercial scale in America? European forests are managed by governments over centuries. We're private businesses operating in decades. What if I'm destroying my family's future trying to save forests?" Robert finished. "I've asked myself that every night for 3 months. What's the answer?" Robert thought about Thomas's anger, his wife's disappointment, the weight of 3 generations of Fairchild wealth evaporating. Then he thought about the creek bed full of empty buckets, the salmon streams choked with silt, the 3 dead in Cascade Springs. "I don't know, he said honestly, "but I know what happens if we keep extracting. I've seen it. The drought isn't bad luck, it's consequence. The flooding wasn't an act of God, it was cause and effect. We can pretend forests are infinite inventory. Or we can learn to work with finite living systems. Those are the only choices. Even if it bankrupts you, even then." Samuel turned from the window. "Then I'm not resigning. We finish what we started, that night." Marcus Webb's final offer arrived by courier: sell all operations to Webb Consolidated Timber for 60 cents on the dollar. Accept consultancy position with no operational authority. All experimental programs terminated immediately. Robert read it twice, then fed it to the fireplace. He spent the next week liquidating personal assets, his mansion in Portland's West Hills, his shares in the railroad, even his late father's pocket watch. Everything that could be sold without touching the core timber operations or the experimental plots. The money bought him time, perhaps 3 months. His wife moved back to her family in Seattle. Thomas stopped speaking to him entirely. Robert stood alone in the tree nursery, surrounded by seedlings that represented everything he'd sacrificed and nothing he could quantify in traditional terms. The empty bucket had reversed. Now it was his bank accounts, his social capital, his family relationships running dry. Samuel found him there at dusk. "The survival rates on the January plantings are 73%, Samuel said quietly, "better than expected for winter transplants." Robert nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in his throat. They stood together as darkness fell, two men who'd bet everything on the idea that forests were worth more alive than dead. Around them, thousands of seedlings bent in the evening breeze, growing despite doubt, surviving despite the odds, fragile, alive, not yet defeated. The drought that had simmered through fall and winter exploded into crisis that spring. By April, every well in the valley was failing. Robert's deepest wells, drilled 200 feet down, produced nothing but dry stone. His sawmills sat completely silent now, their boilers cold, their water wheels dry as ancient bones. But his competitors fared worse. The operations that had continued aggressive clear-cutting through winter now faced catastrophic consequences. Their logged watersheds retained no moisture whatsoever. Springs that had flowed for centuries vanished. Streams became dust. Marcus Webb's flagship mill shut down in May, its water source completely gone. The man who'd orchestrated Robert's destruction now faced his own. Then came the dust storm. It rolled in from the clear-cut mountains on May 15th, a wall of brown air 3,000 feet high, blotting out the sun at midday, wind-driven soil from exposed hillsides, turning atmosphere to choking grit. Robert was in the experimental plots when it hit. Visibility dropped to arm's length. He wrapped his bandana over nose and mouth, tasting dust and devastation with each breath. The air was thick enough to cut. Around him, the young trees bent nearly horizontal under the wind, but their roots held them firm. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally cleared, the valley looked apocalyptic. Dust coated everything 6 inches deep. Livestock lay dead in fields, suffocated. Crops were buried. Buildings wore brown shrouds. The world had turned monochrome shades of brown and gray, replacing all color. Robert stood in the main street of Salem, looking at devastation that made Cascade Springs seem minor. This wasn't flood damage that could be repaired. This was the land itself rising up to reject what had been done to it. Samuel found him there, both of them ghostly with dust. "The land is showing us what we've done," Samuel said quietly, "and what we must undo." Robert turned to him, and something broke loose in his chest. Not despair, but clarity. Absolute, crystalline understanding. This was the future he'd been creating, the logical endpoint of extraction. A world where the land itself became uninhabitable because the living systems that sustained it had been destroyed. "Even if it bankrupts me," Robert said, "I will fight for a different model, not because it's profitable, because it's right." Samuel extended his hand. Robert took it, not employer and consultant, but partners in something larger than business. 2 men standing in a devastated valley, shaking hands on commitment to restoration rather than extraction. "We're going to lose," Samuel said. "The takeover. The business web will have it all within months. Then we lose the business but win the argument." Robert looked around at the dust-choked world. "We prove there's another way, and we teach anyone willing to learn. That's the only legacy that matters." They walked together through the brown streets toward the experimental plots. The young trees were coated in dust, but alive, their roots holding soil that hadn't blown away. Small victories in an ocean of devastation. That night, Robert wrote a letter to every timber operator in Oregon Territory, extending an invitation to visit his experimental plots, review his data, learn what he'd learned. He expected no response. He mailed it anyway. The dark night had passed, not into certainty or triumph, but into commitment. Sometimes that was enough. The Timber Conference convened in Portland on July 20th. 1886, 100 operators representing every major logging concern in Oregon Territory. They gathered expecting Robert Fairchild to admit failure, perhaps publicly apologize for his radical experiments instead. Robert stood before them and declared war on the industry's fundamental assumptions. Gentlemen, I've called you here to discuss the future of timber in this territory. Not next quarter's profits, the actual future, 50 years from now, 100, what will be left? He gestured to Samuel, who unveiled a series of maps showing regional forest cover over time. The progression was stark thick green in 1850, thinning through the decades, projected to near total loss by 1920 at current harvest rates. We're not in the timber business, Robert said. We're in the liquidation business. We're selling off ecological capital accumulated over millennia and calling it sustainable enterprise. It's suicide. Murmurs of anger rippled through the crowd. Marcus Webb stood, voice dripping contempt. Fairchild, you've gone bankrupt chasing romantic nonsense. Why should we listen to a failed operator? Because my operations haven't failed, they've adapted. Robert displayed Samuel's latest data. Selective cutting generates 80% of clear cuttings yield while maintaining 70% forest cover. Replanting ensures future harvest. Watershed protection guarantees the water our mills need to operate. The European forestry institutes have proven this over 2 centuries. It works. On government land with infinite timelines, another operator called. We need profit now. You need water now, Sete, Robert shot back. Every mill in this room has faced drought closures this year. Webb's flagship operation is still shut down. Why? Because we destroyed the watershed infrastructure that generates consistent water flow. He paused, letting that sink in. Forests aren't inventory, they're infrastructure, living capital that generates returns across generations, but only if we manage them as living systems instead of dead assets. He unveiled his final proposal, the Fairchild Forestry Institute, funded by the liquidation of his personal fortune, free education in sustainable forestry practices, research programs in watershed management, selective harvesting, reforestation techniques, open to anyone willing to learn operators, workers, indigenous communities, immigrants, women. I'm done being a timber baron, Robert said. I'm becoming an educator because the only way this industry survives is if we collectively learn to see forests as something other than board feet. The room erupted, some in anger, some in mockery, but a surprising number in questions. How much did selective cutting really yield? What were the replanting costs? Could it work at commercial scale? Robert spent 3 hours presenting data, showing photographs of the experimental plots, explaining European models and indigenous practices. Samuel fielded technical questions about hydrology, silviculture, long-term growth projections. By evening's end, most had left dismissive or hostile, but 17 operators, younger men, mostly, whose fathers hadn't yet handed down certainty, stayed to ask more questions. Could they visit the plots? Review the full data, discuss implementation. Robert invited them all. Marcus Webb cornered him in the lobby afterward. You think you've won something. You haven't. I control your company. I'll have it liquidated by September. Then liquidate it, Robert said calmly. I don't need the company anymore. I need the idea to spread, and it's already spreading. Webb stalked off, but Robert barely noticed. He was watching a young operator from Eugene talking with Samuel about riparian buffers, taking notes, asking thoughtful questions. The seed was planted. Whether it would grow, that was out of Robert's hands now. He'd sacrificed his wealth, his social standing, his family relationships. He had perhaps 2 months before bankruptcy, but he'd transformed from baron to advocate, from extractor to educator. He'd planted ideas that would outlive his business, maybe outlive him. Sometimes legacy wasn't what you took, sometimes it was what you left growing. Robert stood on the ridgeline where this had all begun, watching the sun break over the Cascades in shades of amber and gold. 2 years had passed. Fall of 1887. He was 55 years old, and the world looked completely different. Below him, The landscape was still scarred. 10,000 acres of stumps didn't heal in 2 years. But among those stumps, young trees were rising, Douglas fir saplings reaching toward light, cedar seedlings spreading across formerly bare ground, maple and alder filling gaps. Not the old-growth forest that had stood here, but the beginning of something. Life returning. The streams ran clear again. Not full, the drought had broken, but rains remained sporadic. Yet the water was transparent now. The silt settling out as replanted slopes stabilized. In the lower reaches, biologists had documented salmon returning to spawn for the first time in 3 years. Small numbers, tentative, but alive. The Fairchild Forestry Institute spread across the valley below. Its buildings constructed from salvaged lumber, Robert's final timber operation. Dismantled and repurposed. 40 students in the first class, young operators learning sustainable practices. Indigenous scholars documenting traditional knowledge. Immigrants like Samuel bringing European methods. 3 women defying convention to study forest science. Samuel Chen stood beside him. No longer a student, but the Institute's director. In 2 years, he'd aged into authority. Gaining respect through competence rather than inheritance. The forestry program he'd designed drew students from across the territory. The enrollment requests keep coming, Samuel said. We'll need to expand again next year. Robert nodded. Watching the students work in experimental plots below, they were testing selective cutting patterns, measuring growth rates, documenting species regeneration. Science replacing guesswork, data replacing assumption. Along the restored stream courses, rain barrels caught seasonal precipitation, the empty buckets refilling. Communities that had faced water rationing now managed carefully but adequately. Not abundance yet, but sufficiency. The possibility of renewal. Movement on the path caught Robert's attention. Thomas climbed toward them, breathing hard from the ascent. His son had spent a year avoiding him after the business collapsed. Then, 6 months ago, he'd shown up at the Institute unannounced, asking questions, watching the work, slowly, reluctantly, beginning to understand. Father, Thomas reached the ridge, accepting a canteen from Samuel. The delegation from California is here. They want to tour the replanted sections. All of them, 12 operators, 3 government forestry officials. They're serious about implementing standards. Robert felt something unfamiliar, not pride exactly, but satisfaction, the kind that came from work that mattered beyond himself. Marcus Webb had liquidated Fairchild Timber as promised, selling every asset for parts. Robert had lost everything financial, but ideas were spreading. Operators across the region were experimenting with selective cutting, establishing their own replanting programs. The territorial legislature was debating watershed protection laws. The concept of forests as living infrastructure rather than dead inventory was taking root in minds that would shape the next century. I'll meet them in an hour, Robert said. Let them walk the plots first. Let the land teach them. Thomas hesitated. I've been thinking about what you said, about legacy, and I want to work here, at the Institute, learning what you're learning. He looked uncomfortable, vulnerable in a way Robert had never seen him. If you'll have me, Robert gripped his son's shoulder, unable to speak. After a moment, Thomas nodded and headed back down the trail. Samuel diplomatically found reason to examine seedlings elsewhere, leaving Robert alone on the ridge. He knelt beside a young Douglas fir, one of the first plantings from 2 years ago. It stood perhaps 4 feet tall now, its branches spreading, its needles healthy green. In 80 years, this would be harvestable timber. In 200 years, old-growth forest. In 500 years, part of an ecosystem that sustained communities Robert couldn't imagine. He would never see it mature. That was exactly the point. His hands touched the soft needles, feeling life sustained not by extraction but by reciprocity. Human and forest in relationship rather than dominance, the long view instead of the quick profit. Below, students were planting more seedlings in systematic patterns, their voices carrying up the ridge. Among them, indigenous elders teaching traditional knowledge. European-trained foresters sharing scientific methods. Young operators learning to see trees as living capital. Robert stood, dusting soil from his hands. The empty buckets of his arrival on this ridge, profit calculations, extraction rates, dominance over wilderness had been replaced by something harder to quantify, but infinitely more valuable. Purpose, continuity, the knowledge that what he planted would keep growing long after his name was forgotten. He descended toward the institute, toward the work that would fill his remaining years, teaching what Samuel had taught him, passing forward the wisdom that forests were not resources to be used up, but partners to be tended. That real wealth was measured in healthy watersheds and returning salmon, in seedlings that would become giants generations hence. The morning sun illuminated the valley below stumps and saplings, devastation and renewal, the long, patient work of healing. It would take centuries to restore what decades had destroyed, but the work had begun. Robert Fairchild, who had spent 30 years cutting forests down, would spend the rest of his life teaching others to plant them. The circle was not complete, it never would be in his lifetime, but it was turning. And that, he had learned, was enough.